Let me welcome you again to this, our third event in our virtual series on the politics of the pandemic. So our first two events looked at the ethics of rationing healthcare during a pandemic and at running elections and voting during a pandemic. And if you want to watch either of those events, you can see those actually on our YouTube station in the archive, or you can go to our Foley Institute webpage and look up past events, and you can find links to them there as well. Today's event is going to look at the politics of hoarding and panic buying and its relationship to social disconnectedness. Today's event is also being live streamed on YouTube. And if you're watching live and you'd like to ask some questions to our panelists, I encourage you to send those to us via email at tsfoley, that's Thomas S. Foley, tsfoley@wsu.edu. And we should be able to get to most of those questions later in our discussion. So last month across the United States, supermarket shelves were stripped bare of many different commodities. Some of these made perfect sense, like hand sanitizer, disinfectants, or rubber gloves, but other items really had no logical connection to a virus outbreak. Indeed, one item in particular that flew off the shelves was toilet paper. For some reason, toilet paper became the object of panic buying. It led to incidents of shopper violence, stealing, and even armed robberies. Panic buying and hoarding are neither a new phenomena nor unique to the United States. Indeed, toilet paper shortages also occurred last month in the United Kingdom, in Australia, and in Japan. But the problem is far more acute and widespread today in the United States. At the individual level, hoarding has long been a diagnosable social or psychological disorder. But that's about collecting and retaining huge amounts of worthless items. Other psychological theories suggest that individuals engage in panic buying in order to assert a sense of control during a crisis. But empty supermarket shelves don't necessarily mean that we have all suddenly become irrational. And fear of losing control only is triggered when there's a sense that we cannot trust and count on others. So what's going on? Our guests today believe that part of the answer is found in broader political forces that have led Americans to feel less connected to one another. Our first guest will be Hans Hocker. Hans is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Arkansas State University, where he teaches law and American politics. His research interests include American pragmatism, judicial decision-making, and law and society. A TED Talk that Hans recently gave about today's topic has already been viewed more than 200,000 times online. Following Hans, we will hear from William Blake, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Maryland at Baltimore. His research interests include public attitudes towards politics and the Constitution, as well as religion in the law and baseball in the law. Now, I've asked each of our guests today to take about 15 minutes or so on some preliminary comments. And then after that, we'll have some time to open it up for some discussion and questions. So once again, if you'd like to ask questions, I encourage you to send those to us via email at tsfoley@wsu.edu. So gentlemen, I am now going to mute my mic and turn the time over to you, and I'll be back later with some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here at the Thomas Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service to speak to you today on the topic of why hoard toilet paper, the pandemic, and social connectedness. So let's get right to it. Why are people hoarding toilet paper and hand sanitizer? I mean, we've all heard the reports of shoppers fighting each other in the aisles for the last 4-pack of paper towels and looting trucks of paper products. As a civil society scholar, it strikes me that people are stockpiling goods because they are trying to win the pandemic and beat their neighbors at what is sometimes a very grim and disturbing game. Today, I will try to address what it is that motivates people to turn shelves that look like this into shelves that look like this. Some people might say that the reason we stockpile goods is because we don't like each other. We are uncivil. People are so antagonistic toward one another that they will trample their neighbors on the way to buying out entire shelves of toilet paper. In fact, a lot of people attribute most of the problems in society, including our response to the coronavirus, to a lack of civility, particularly in politics. Name calling, conspiracy theories, demonizing the opposition, these are all features of politics in America today, in an election year in which things are nasty, and they're about to get a lot worse. I want to talk about how incivility is not the problem. Today, I make 2 points. First, the problems in our society and politics result from a loss of vital connection. We are disconnected and disassociated from each other, from government, and from our communities. And second, we can understand this problem a little bit better by analogizing it to the rules of a game. So, why is disconnection and not incivility the problem? It's because uncivil people may be mean and rude, but disconnected people behave selfishly. Think about it like this. It's Thanksgiving. After your family has driven each other nuts, arguments have broken out, your significant other is no longer speaking to you, you know, your traditional American Thanksgiving celebration, and it's time for dessert. What keeps you from taking the large piece of this pie for yourself and leaving scraps for everyone else? It's your connection to your family and friends, right? You're a part of a group. What kind of a sociopath takes all the pie, leaving their family with just that little sliver on the left? The different ways in which we respond to pumpkin pie and toilet paper illustrate a much documented problem in the United States. What we hear is this: today, society is uncivil, nasty, and vitriolic. But here's the reason that doesn't explain much. American society and politics is ugly and uncivil, but it has always been. When this guy, Alexis de Tocqueville, visited the United States in 1831, he found a people engaged in what he called a vibrant democracy. Now, this is our idealized vision of vibrant democracy. But this isn't what de Tocqueville found. By vibrant, he meant ugly, vicious, caustic, and sometimes violent. Newspapers were aligned with political parties. One Federalist newspaper warned that if Thomas Jefferson were elected president, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest would be openly taught and practiced. Even George Washington wasn't insulated from abuse. You may recall that from the play Hamilton, that these are the words that got Charles Lee shot in a duel with John Lawrence. Politics then looked very much like politics now. Saying our politics is uncivil doesn't really explain what's different. So if incivility doesn't account for the real problems we have in American politics and society today, what does? What's different? What's changed? Political scientist Robert Putnam has noted that in the 1800s, after Americans got done abusing and maligning each other, they went to church together. They had dinner with their neighbors without much thought to their politics. They played baseball together. They joined civic organizations together, and their children married each other. People felt connected to each other into society in a way that transcended political differences. They connected their personal interests with the interests of the community. Alexis de Tocqueville referred to this feature of 18th century America as civic virtue. So what's the difference today? Unlike 1831, Americans today feel disconnected from each other, their communities, government, society, and all the things that bind people together as a people. We are departing public life in droves. We are disillusioned, discouraged, and angry. We have much less of what de Tocqueville called civic virtue. The documented process looks like this. As we become more affluent, we become more individualistic and self-involved. As we become more self-involved, we become disassociated because we find it intolerable to associate with someone who thinks differently than we do. Generally, people have two responses to living in this kind of society. Some people begin sorting themselves into tribes of like-minded others and only associating with people who think as they do. But unfortunately, when you only speak to people who confirm your pre-existing biases, you have fewer and fewer meaningful, challenging, mind-expanding associations. We end up having a conversation with ourselves and becoming furious with those who think differently. Now, many other people didn't sort themselves into tribes. They just simply went home and turned on Netflix. A consequence of doing this is social isolation. Study after study correlates increasing wealth and affluence in Western democracies with a range of pathologies: social disconnectedness, loneliness, declining civic participation, and a lack of trust in government. Disconnectedness and social isolation correspond with a decline in empathy for others, a rise in emotional dysregulation, depression, anxiety, narcissism, and a range of psychopathologies and neuroses. Today, I want to offer a way of thinking about this that might help us break out of the social isolation and the silos of similar opinion into which we have warehoused our brains. Think of your connections to society, to your friends, family, neighbors, community, government, coworkers, as a game. What are the rules of the game you are playing? First thing to know, there are generally two types of games. Second, you might think you're playing one game, but you can be wrong about that. So what are these two types of games? The first is called a collective game. You play a game as a group. To win, the group must win. An example of this would be Dungeons and Dragons or World of Warcraft. The second type of game is called zero-sum games. You play a game as an individual. To win, everyone else must lose. And there are lots of examples of games like this, but one that comes to mind is Monopoly. Now, there are some games we play where someone will win, but we really don't care. The group experience is what counts. For example, a more modern game called Cards Against Humanity comes to mind. So how does this apply to society and politics? Well, first, people with a connection to society are playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're the civic-minded, and they're playing a collective game as a group. People in disassociated tribes are playing Monopoly. People who have isolated themselves have stopped playing altogether. Now, society by definition is a collective game. Let's be clear, all games have their problems. Just because you are playing a collective game doesn't mean you win. The problem with collective games is getting group members to behave well in the group, to not behave selfishly and exploit group resources. An example of this from quite a while ago is Leroy Jenkins. If anybody remembers that, it's an example of a group of people playing World of Warcraft who are attempting to coordinate their activities before they go through a door. On the other side of that door, they know there are monsters. As they're attempting to coordinate, one member of the group just goes off on his own, yells his name out, and runs through the door. The group doesn't know what to do, but they follow him in and everyone dies. Everyone loses because of the bad behavior of this one individual. Now, we know that was a setup. It didn't actually happen in the game, it was staged, but it's a very good example of what happens to groups when one member won't behave. As I said, society by definition is a collective game. For some reason, though, we often think of it as a zero-sum game. But bad things start to happen when you think you're playing one game, but you're actually playing another. Consider this example. A man brushes by a second man on the subway. When they collide by accident, the first man tells the second man to go F himself. The first man continues on to his interview, where he discovers that the person who will be interviewing him is the man he just cussed out on the subway. The first man on the subway thought he was playing a zero-sum game, but he was in a collective game in which he wanted a job and his interviewer wanted to hire someone, and everyone lost. The problem with zero-sum games is this: it is hard to identify the bad actor. For example, these three people represent a society, but it's one in which a powerful person with many resources convinced the two other members to play a zero-sum game with each other over the scarce resources remaining to them. And lest anyone think I'm suggesting that only the rich can be bad actors, note that bad actors exist at any point in the socioeconomic scale, wherever anyone acts to exploit the group. Consider this example of where we can find bad actors and the names we call them. They are predators, rent seekers, and cronies. Here's another example of how defining life in zero-sum terms can obscure the bad actor. This was posted on Instagram. The woman that you see just a portion of her face is sitting in front of a man. They're traveling on an airplane together. She reclines her seat back into his personal space, spilling all of his food and drink into his lap. For the remainder of the flight, that man pounds his fist on the back of her headrest. Now, who is the bad actor here? I mean, two people traveling and only one will travel in comfort. So who's the bad actor? Well, it's the airline. The airline that has put them in this situation and crammed as many people as possible into a small space. But instead of confronting the airline for putting them in this situation by maybe voting with their feet and going traveling on another airline, they both direct their anger and blame at each other. On the other hand, here are two examples of Americans playing the collective game. First, the NBA season is canceled. March Madness is canceled. Scores of retail chains have closed. For the first time in history, all 50 states have declared a state of emergency. And I'm speaking to you via the internet. People who stand to lose millions of dollars made most of these decisions voluntarily, but they made these decisions for a collective good. As good actors, they realized that if they played the zero-sum game, the harm to society would be catastrophic. Second, Americans have coalesced in a bipartisan way around pandemic policy. In a recent article published in The Atlantic, the authors note that often upwards of 70% of those surveyed favored extraordinary measures designed to save lives and weather the current crisis, with very slight variation in party identification. Those authors present their findings as a constitutional crisis. But if we think about this as a collective game, the real concern should be identifying bad actors who intend to exploit the crisis for personal gain. Eventually, we will have to turn our attention to such concerns. As the Supreme Court stated in Home Building and Loan Association versus Blaisdell, emergency does not increase constitutional power, nor diminish constitutional restrictions. Emergency may, however, furnish occasion for exercising the powers possessed. That is the constitutional principle controlling the use of governmental power to meet a crisis. Americans seem to support such measures. And The Blaisdell rule also seems to endorse Madison's contention in Federalist 51 that if men were angels, we would have no need for auxiliary precautions, such as checks on executive power. The quality of governance we seem to have lost appears in the painting commemorating the Declaration of Independence I showed earlier. If we take a closer look, we see that the painter has paid homage to the conflicts existing among the group of people signing the document by portraying the frustration that Jefferson caused Adams. Notice Jefferson is trotting on Adams' foot even as they sign the document. What is lost upon us is how sharp, angry political division turned later in life into real and intimate association among true friends, right until the moment of their deaths. So what's the upshot? Society stands a better chance of surviving when members define life as a collective effort. The group is focused on achieving common goals and also identifying and stopping bad actors. Society is less likely to survive when members define life as a zero-sum game. Individuals focus on competing with each other, thus bad actors can hide more easily and exploit common resources. So stop worrying about anger and incivility and start connecting. Start playing the collective game. If we play the collective game, we address bad actors with a great deal more credibility when we say, you may be exploiting your position for personal gain, but we are coming for you. Thank you very much for your time, and I will now turn the mic over to Dr. Blake.
Thank you very much, and give me just a second to get my screen set up. Well, thank you and good afternoon. As Dr. Hawker so expertly argued, we can overcome anxiety and suffering by reconceptualizing our most basic behavior, like the decision to buy toilet paper, as a collective game. I want to talk a little bit more about the political implications of this paradigm. It is tempting to view politics as a zero-sum game. After all, for someone to win office, everyone else running in the election must lose. But that doesn't tell the whole story. In fact, the fundamental reason we have governments is to make all people better off. Today, I want to discuss 2 episodes from American history when our politics was a distinctly collective enterprise. One great thing about adding this talk to my CV is that it gets me a bit closer to joining the list of famous alumni from my high school. W.T. Woodson High School in Fairfax, Virginia is known for educating 3 important people, although I warn you, this list goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Catherine Coleman was the second American woman ever to have served on the International Space Station. Next, Woodson claims Austin St. John, the original Red Power Ranger, as an alum. And finally, there is Chris McCandless, the kid who went into the wild. Although McCandless was born about 15 years before me, I know exactly where his family lived. The McCandless story was interesting to me for personal reasons, but why did it fascinate so many other people? The reason is simple. McCandless did something that John Locke thought impossible. No, not that John Locke, the character from the television show Lost. John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher. Locke, in his second treatise on government, wrote, "To understand political power, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions as they think fit, without depending upon the will of any other man." By living alone in the Alaskan wilderness, McCandless entered what Locke called the state of nature, where he enjoyed perfect freedom, at least until he died from eating poisonous seeds. Because he was alone, McCandless could play neither zero-sum nor collective games, except perhaps a futile game of survival against the elements. John Locke concluded that most of us are not like Chris McCandless. We do not desire to live in the state of nature. So we formed governments, giving up some of our freedom in exchange for stability. This decision made everyone in society better off than they would be fending for themselves, a classic example of a collective game. Locke also believed that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed and have an obligation to protect individual rights, namely life, liberty, and property. If you're thinking, I've heard these phrases before, you're right. Thomas Jefferson borrowed heavily from Locke when writing the Declaration of Independence. Today, Americans look to the beginning of the Declaration to find inspiration. The second sentence contains the famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Reciting this line conjures images of fireworks and parades, but political theorist Mary Ann Glendon reminds us that the American obsession with unalienable rights has a political downside. It has an established and intractable zero-sum game problem. Glendon says that our absolutist rhetoric about rights, quote, promotes unrealistic expectations, heightens social conflict, and inhibits dialogue that might lead towards consensus, accommodation, or at least the discovery of common ground. Glendon interprets the legacy of Locke and Jefferson like this. Two people with opposing interests have the capacity to compromise. When two people meet in the middle, it might seem like neither one wins, but in the long run, compromise makes everyone better off by resolving disputes more efficiently. But consider the cost of compromise when two people have opposing rights claims. You see, interests are transient, but rights come from nature, or depending upon which philosopher you believe, nature's God. Either way, they are unalienable. That is, it is against our nature to abandon our rights. Thus, in any fight involving rights, you had better win, because compromising means losing part of your humanity. Rights disputes in both the short run and the long run are zero-sum games. But to the founders, the second sentence of the Declaration was not particularly important. It was merely a restatement of an idea already in the zeitgeist. What made the Declaration of Independence truly revolutionary was its last sentence. Here, Jefferson wrote, "And for the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Unlike the opening passage, which focuses on what the individual cannot be made to do, the Declaration closes with a statement of what the community must do. The founders made it clear that they were playing a collective game, or as Benjamin Franklin put it, we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly, shall all hang separately. We can see another collective game at work in 1776 if we take one step back from Philadelphia. Contrary to popular belief, the delegates to the Continental Congress did not sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. That happened on August 2nd. 3 weeks after that, New York City fell to the British Army and America was split in two. The Continental Army was no match for the British, which brings us to why the Declaration was written in the first place. Americans already knew that they had natural rights. No, instead, the Declaration served as an appeal to France and Spain. Jefferson told these countries that Americans were not mere British subjects rebelling against a mother country. We were an independent nation, appealing to fellow sovereigns for a mutually beneficial military alliance. And the gambit worked. Both France and Spain eventually declared war against Britain, and French forces played a pivotal role in ending the war at the Battle of Yorktown. When citizens believe politics is a collective game, new nations can be born, and ragtag militiamen can defeat the greatest army on the planet. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are the two most important written works in American political history. But what was the most influential speech ever delivered? I would argue that the answer is not the Gettysburg Address, George Washington's farewell address, or for that matter, any of the rap battles from Hamilton. The key word here is influence, as in the speech did more than raise people's spirits. It actually changed people's behavior. Now you might be tempted to say Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural, when he declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." To this, I would say, right president, wrong speech. During Roosevelt's first week in office, thousands of anxious Americans had withdrawn their life savings from banks teetering on the edge of collapse. Many banks did not have enough good assets to accommodate the panic. Even solvent banks could not access enough cash from the US Mint to hand over to their customers. This was a vicious zero-sum game. The financial security of ordinary people came at the direct expense of banks being able to balance their books. So Roosevelt closed the banks and took to the airwaves, sitting next to an unlit fireplace in the White House diplomatic reception room. 40 million Americans, or about half the voting age population, listened as the president offered two contradictory messages. On the one hand, he urged people to take money out from under the mattress and put it back in their bank. On the other hand, he acknowledged that, quote, "When the banks reopen, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals." But he said the bank would, quote, "take care of all needs, including those wanting to pull their money out." Roosevelt ended his fireside chat with this passage. "After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system. It is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail." When the banks began to reopen the next day, Americans queued up in droves once again. Bank employees did not know if the customers waiting in line were there to make withdrawals or deposits. Which of the two messages from the president did they heed? Walter Wyatt, a lawyer for the Federal Reserve System, described the reaction to the speech as, quote, "one of the most dramatic things that I ever saw. As soon as the banks reopened, the money started pouring back in." Roosevelt, said Wyatt, did a magnificent job with that fireside speech, and he just completely changed the whole psychology. Today, the 1930s seem as distant a part of our history as the 1770s. In these polarized times, it behooves us to remember that many leaders since Roosevelt have tried to change the whole psychology of politics into a collective rather than a zero-sum game. The Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service pays homage to a leader known for his commitment to bipartisan cooperation. When I was an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary, I had the opportunity to be on a panel with Speaker Foley, and he could not have been kinder or more thoughtful. Meeting him was one of the highlights of my education. So it is with profound gratitude that I want to thank Cornell Clayton for inviting me and Dr. Hocker to be here today. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. Politics might seem like a zero-sum game, full of winners and losers, heroes and villains. But as John Locke reminds us, the reason governments exist is to make all of us better off. And Americans have placed cooperation ahead of selfishness at several potential turning points in our history. In 1776, the War for Independence seemed lost before it had even really began. In 1933, capitalism seemed on the verge of collapse. Today, we encounter another unprecedented time, fraught with anxiety and suffering. My sincere hope is that we remember our capacity to unite in banishing fear, because Roosevelt's message remains just as true today. Together, we cannot fail. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Hans and William. So I got several questions in. Let me start with two questions for Hans, one more serious than the other. The less serious one is what is it about toilet paper in particular that people wanted to start hoarding? What's the psychology behind that?
That was a bit outside the scope of the paper, but or I'm sorry, of the presentation, but it's a really crucial question, I think, because it gets to the psychology that that Cornell you talked about at the beginning when you were introducing us, that people who are dependent upon each other and recognize that codependency and that collective, that they are a member of a collective, they become much less anxious about whether they are going to be able to continue to get their food, to get ordinary things of life that are necessary to survive. So, like, for example, we depend upon each other more crucially for our subsistence than the founders did at the time of the signing of the Declaration. I don't grow my own food. Very few people in this society do. And so I think that kind of anxiety is built into the system when you play the zero-sum game, and recognizing the collective attributes of society sort of pulls that anxiety level, that stress level down. I think it's an indication, actually, whether they pick toilet paper or something else, that people are very anxious about being so dependent upon other people who may be exploiting them.
Okay, thanks. So, so a more serious question, though. Several audience members have asked it's really a question about how do you make bad actors behave during a period of crisis like this. One viewer actually put it in terms of, what do you do about Leroy Jenkins? So how do you enforce people to behave on the basis of a collective game rather than a zero-sum game during a period of crisis?
So those who are familiar with the Leroy Jenkins thing will understand this remark, but I am very happy that he got his chicken. I hope he did. So there are two things you can do. One is you can let them go out into the wild. I mean, he was the Chris McCandless of World of Warcraft, right? You can just let him go. The other thing you can do is you can deliver a fireside chat. In other words, you can lay out for this individual the consequences of their behavior and then let them make that decision. I don't think our leaders are doing a very complete job of laying that out for us. And I think Dr. Blake, he's right. That was a moment in history, and not even President Reagan really was able to bring the society together in that same way. But that was an extraordinary crisis, an extraordinary moment of crisis.
Yeah. What about the use of law to enforce good behavior during periods of crisis? I'm thinking right now, in particular, for instance, these protests you see about the stay-at-home orders and people not only violating the orders from their governors, but oftentimes flouting sort of the norms or the advice of medical experts to stay 6 feet apart, to wear masks, things like that. Should we be using the law to enforce better behavior?
Well, clearly yes, but also getting at the heart of that question, you can explain to someone that the police power is a founding principle of law in the United States, that government is there, hearkening back, long before colonies in North America to Cicero, that law is there for the benefit of the collective, that government, when it acts, it should act for the collective good. And these individuals they're looking to the first sentence of the Declaration rather than to the last one. And that's an excellent question. Yeah.
Let me pick that up and ask William a question. So you were pretty hard on the idea of rights in your presentation. You're relying on Marianne Glendon's work, but it is true that a central part of American political culture is our belief in individual rights. So should we think about rights in a time like this? And again, let me give you an example. There's a lot of people who think that these stay-at-home orders violate their individual rights to peaceably assemble or more to the point, many religious groups think that they violate their rights to free exercise of religion. So how should we balance individual rights to vis-a-vis the collective good in crises like this?
Well, and it's not just the religion clauses in the Constitution or the free speech clause. It's all sorts of things. The right to interstate travel has been restricted in ways that would never be upheld in ordinary circumstances. I think there are some legitimate due process concerns with the way that courts have tried to deal with this crisis. So, I mean, this crisis has touched on almost every aspect of the Constitution. And I think that, so I want to clarify, I think neither myself nor Mary Ann Glendon are saying that we should abandon a commitment to rights. But the problem isn't rights, it's our absolutist commitment to them. That's what makes us think that compromise means that you are sacrificing part of your humanity. So I think that the way we have to think about rights is that, and I think Hans was right to reference the Supreme Court case that he did, the Blaisdell case, which took place during the height of the Great Depression. But it echoes some of the same things that Lincoln talked about when he cut back on a lot of rights during the Civil War. And that is, it doesn't make any sense for the entire community to collapse just to protect one part of our constitutional system. And so if you want, in Lincoln's case, it was suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And he says, what good is it to preserve the writ of habeas corpus if that's the one part of the Constitution that ends up surviving the Civil War? And he said, so, to save the Union and the entire concept of the Constitution in extraordinary times, we have to be more willing to put temporary restrictions on our rights. And that's a very difficult thing to do, given how foundational rights are to our political culture.
So another question from the audience, and I think I'll ask William this. You talked a lot about previous periods in history when we've had this sense of a collective, that we're in this collectively, that this is a cooperative game we're playing, and less so today. And that might be because we have less that unifies us today in our culture and our religious traditions. We've become much more pluralistic over the last century or so. So a student who's watching asks, why should people behave as if they are part of a collective when they functionally are not any longer?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge is the empirical reality is we are largely disconnected from each other. And so I think it's not as if we can just stop on a dime and recover decades worth of connectedness, or the term that Robert Putnam uses is social capital, that building up those community relationships takes an awful lot of time and effort. So I think maybe the best that can come of this is that this pandemic makes us stop and remember that one of our goals moving forward is that social capital is a valuable commodity that keeps the republic healthy in all sorts of ways. And so that maybe this is a point at which we can start to make a gradual turnaround in the decades-long decline in connectedness that Putnam documents so excellently in his work.
Right. Hey, Hans, so I'm curious whether or not you see this same phenomena at play globally, not just nationally. And I'm thinking here in particular, for instance, the idea of, and the paradigm, using the language of America first in our response, not only to the pandemic, but also in our response to things like climate change and decisions of whether or not to make an economic sacrifice for the good of the planet. Is this the same phenomena you think is at play, or something different?
So those two questions actually sort of come together really nicely. the problem with in groups and out groups in society, or like people not having connection, is that we struggle to identify a common set of goals. But then on this other side, you've got actors who have identified they've distilled a goal for their supporters down to this phrase, America First. And it is a value that is antithetical to the group, the whole, right? To any number of cherished American values, right? And so it actually ends up encouraging authoritarianism here at home and abroad, right? In our relationship with other countries. And it also ultimately ends up fraying the social connections among people even further. So I think that's a really, really good point, is that since we seem to have so much difficulty identifying a tight set of core values, we've sort of supplanted those with these rather authoritarian values. And in our attitude toward other countries, it's undermining all of the connections that we developed when the United States really redesigned foreign policy after World War II, to create a global political community.
And Cornell, can I just jump in on that?
Sure, yeah.
So I find it kind of remarkable that when you compare what's going on within the United States handling the pandemic to how different countries around the world are, both the federal government and the individual states have completely, it seems, outsourced the policy-making agenda around COVID to executives. The president issues executive orders, and each of the governors issued executive orders. And then if you go down to the third layer of American federalism, mayors are issuing executive orders. There is a almost complete absence of legislative guidance in how to handle this situation. And we don't find that in other countries around the world, where parliaments are playing much more active roles. And obviously, the executive is going to control the bureaucracy in most countries. And so the executive is going to have a larger role to play. But in a lot of other countries around the world, legislatures have wanted to maintain a much more active presence. But here in Maryland, the legislature was supposed to be wrapping up just about right now, going home after their 90-day session. But as soon as COVID broke out, they basically said, okay, let's rush through the state budget and everything else can wait until next year. Bye. And they just left a literal power vacuum that was only filled by the governor. And it's kind of interesting because we're sort of used to Congress being held up in gridlock, leaving a lot of room for presidents to maneuver through executive orders. But I think what this crisis is revealing is we have a tendency to want executive dominance, not just at the federal level, but across the states as well. It's worth comparing what's going on at all levels of government in this country to a different pattern of governance decision-making in other countries.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if a couple of comments with respect to that. One may have to do with the fact that the pandemic is somewhat unique. I'm thinking right now about the House of Representatives and the fact that they don't want to come back into session because they're afraid they'll exacerbate the problem in Washington, D.C. that still has the cases on the upswing rather than the downswing. So they don't want to call themselves back into session and further exacerbate the problem. So that may be one of the things going on here. But as you both know, there's a long history of the idea of during emergencies that you vest power in the executive because they can act with dispatch and can respond quickly to events. But it seems to me that you're suggesting that's not such a good thing, that we should look to curb presidential power and maybe the power of governors during this crisis.
Yeah, I think for a domestic crisis, this is kind of new, depending on whether you want to characterize the Civil War as a domestic crisis or a war. The framework that you described, Cornell, is typically described to wars. and like with actual violent combat and a declaration of war, not the sort of the way we use war as a metaphor to describe any social problem today. So I think this is bringing to light an issue in the way Americans want to be governed that is different from how people. Look, a lot of other parliaments across the world have found ways to meet digitally. Congress hasn't even taken any steps forward on that. So even there, there's a disconnect between the role the legislature should play in terms of a willingness to change their normal rules of procedure.
So Hans, another undergraduate who's watching asked the question, do you think that the political psychology work done on in-groups and out-groups explains any of the behavior during the pandemic?
I might need a little bit of clarification. So in terms of just the types of behaviors that we're discouraging, because certainly the types of behaviors we're discouraging oftentimes falls disproportionately on minority groups, and sort of the clamp down on social interaction. Even here in Jonesboro, Arkansas, we still have a curfew in place from 10 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. And so that's relatively easy for a number of affluent people to overcome. It's more difficult for people who live in poorer and minority sections of town and things like that. So I guess I might need a bit of clarification about that. Is it the student saying it's just another opportunity to identify who's worth saving?
I suspect her question has more to do with it's related to that if you see the costs being disproportionately borne by one group or a group different than yours, then you're less likely to see this as a collective game or a cooperative game, and more likely to see it as a zero-sum game.
Right. That also goes back to the whole rhetoric of war, right? That if this is a war and we have been invaded by this virus, then all of it is burdensome, and some people are called upon to bear greater burdens than others. On the other side of that, you've got this notion that if healthcare is so important at this point in time, and that it's really costing some people their lives, then why isn't that a good that we're providing as a collective, as a group? So yeah, we can, the dialogue about things like resources, including access to healthcare and to quality healthcare is changed by the pandemic. I saw someone made the comment that the federal government has told hospitals that they will reimburse them for the costs of treating individuals who lack health insurance. And the response to that was, wow, so it is possible for a single payer to pay hospitals for healthcare for those who lack health insurance. Well, we were told that was an impossibility in this country, and all of a sudden we've got it. So yeah, the rhetoric of in and out groups really contributes to this. What I think that I would like to see is our leaders making an attempt, at least, to identify a set of core values that we could coalesce around, and that is not impossible, even given the diversity of the nation. That set of core values are not going to be as tight as you might find in countries that are less diverse and more authoritarian, but it's worth the effort to bring people together. Certainly, Roosevelt was able to do that when identifying the importance of the banking system for the future of capitalism in the United States.
Right. Yeah, let me ask William about that, because you give that as an example of a president being able to convince the country that this is a collective game we're involved in and not a zero-sum game. I wonder if that's even possible for any president. You know, leave Donald Trump aside for a moment. Could any president have that kind of influence and authority today? And I'm thinking in particular in the context of this fragmented media environment where we have siloed media that has very different messaging based on in intense partisan polarization. You know, you need a prerequisite for that kind of presidential leadership is some kind of basic trust in our major institutions. And I wonder if that's possible today.
Yeah, you're right to note the fragmentation of media, the rise of party polarization, and there has been a slow but gradual decline in trust in all sorts of institutions, both governing and civil institutions. Mark Hetherington has written some fabulous stuff on that. And so it is a lot more difficult today than it would be in the 1930s to ask people to take that kind of a leap of faith. You know, hoarding toilet paper is one thing, but you know, faced with the prospect of losing access to your money, that's a much harder thing to take a leap of faith on. But I still think that there is the possibility of doing it, and we've actually seen a little bit of evidence for this, and that is with the stimulus bill. The federal government announced a set of criteria for businesses to receive payments so that they can continue to pay their employees and their vendors, keep their operations going. You know, there was a process to appeal for, you know, if you met the criteria, send in your paperwork and you can get some of this funding. The problem was the money was gone almost instantaneously because there just wasn't enough money put in given how many businesses were eligible to pull it out. And so a number of businesses, once they realized that the money had been depleted, voluntarily offered to give their part of the stimulus funding back, even though they were legally entitled to it. But they had just gotten lucky by being at the front of the line and were able to get access to the funds before other businesses did. But they took a look at their bottom line and realized, we don't need this as much as other people, and they gave it back. So to a certain extent, that gives me hope. Of course, there's good PR that comes from being a responsible corporate citizen, so I'm not saying it's completely altruistic. But at the end of the day, if you're if you're going up against, you know, huge pressures to please your shareholders versus, you know, some nice publicity, pleasing the shareholders is going to win every single time. So I think there is something to what we've been seeing in terms of companies returning those funds.
All right. Well, maybe that's a good place to end on that hopeful note. So let me just say this will be the last Foley event of the semester. We may have one or two over the summer, depending upon how virtual events, depending upon how things proceed. We'll definitely be back in the fall, either in person or virtually. And so I look forward to all of you coming back then. Let me thank you for joining us today. And let me thank our two guests, Hans Hocker and William Blake, for a really interesting conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for inviting us and also for the really excellent questions. I note that a lot of them came from undergraduates at WSU, and that's really wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.